I want to introduce quickly our panel here. We have Dr. Kylah Hedding, who's going to moderate our discussion of science and the media. We have Amy Mayer from Iowa Public Radio. Lyle, is it Muller or Muller?
Muller.
Muller. See, we're all, yeah, it's a name we're all kind of familiar with right now, right? Lyle Muller from Iowa Watch, one of our co-sponsors for the day. Dr. Daniel Lathrop, who's in the journalism department at the University of Iowa, and Dr. Craig Just, who's an environmental engineer at the University of Iowa, civil and environmental engineer, correct? So I'll let you all take it off. Thank you.
All right. Hi. Welcome. So I think we're going to start by just doing a quick introduction, give you all a brief background for each one of us. And so I just thought I'd start off with myself. I'm an assistant professor in the journalism school at the University of Iowa. Prior to getting my PhD, I actually spent about 10 years working in PR in the water industry. And about 5 of those years, or about half that time, working at the American Waterworks Association as the public affairs manager. And so since we're talking about, science and media, I just thought I'd share a story. So part of my job at AWWA was fielding media calls, and then going to our, esteemed engineers and scientists that worked at AWWA and, trying to get the answers to what were generally, very simple general questions that most general reporters had about, water and water science and water quality and different things. And I could never get a simple answer from my engineers and my scientists, and they could never, for sure say anything. And it was always very frustrating as a PR person because, all the journalists, were like, well, we just need an answer, and I could never just give them an answer. And so I very quickly learned to figure out what I thought the answer was, and then go to my engineers and scientists and say, hey, if I tell the reporter this, is it wrong? Not is it right? And so that's sort of my story. But I'll let you guys each introduce yourselves.
Okay. I'm Amy Mayer. I'm the agriculture reporter at Iowa Public Radio, and we are part of Harvest Public Media, which is a regional reporting collaboration. Each of the member stations has an ag reporter, so I'm the Harvest Public Media reporter for IPR. I've been working as a journalist for about 25 years. I've been here at IPR for almost 7. And before that, I worked more general assignment, but with a bit of a focus on health and healthcare and science reporting. I was in a couple of different NPR stations. I worked freelance. I did a lot of print reporting, website. I've always done my own photography because I started out as a photographer, so I'm kind of the gamut. And an example, just a recent example of covering science, I did a story, it was just a spot news story, which for us means it's about 45 seconds long, and it includes, a 15-second soundbite from the person who you interview. The story was about a comprehensive study of the impact of Bt seeds on the environment. And pretty much any time you do any reporting on anything involving genetic modification, you're guaranteed to get angry responses. So the paper was specifically about what the environmental impacts of Bt seeds had been, especially above and beyond the growth of the crop without the impediment of whatever thing the Bt modification was preventing. So, the Bt successfully prevented, say, I'm going to get it wrong and someone's going to correct me. It's either the corn borer or the corn. One of them Bt works really well with, and the other one it doesn't work as well within corn. But anyway, you grow your Bt corn and you don't have this damaging pest. What were the other implications in the ecosystem? And this paper found that, for example, when herbicides are used in addition to a Bt trait, less of the herbicide is used, and it's a more targeted herbicide. So you're not doing the categoric damage to the ecosystem that previously, before Bt, you would have been doing with a broad spectrum herbicide that allows more of the organisms in the soil to survive and provide some natural protection for future crops. And another interesting thing they found was that on fields adjacent to Bt crops, they also found some protective results from that success in the soil microbes and ecosystem. So in other words, fields that did not have Bt technology were experiencing some of the benefits of Bt technology as a sort of halo effect. So I did the story. It was, short and simple, based on this particular meta-analysis study. And I got a message the next morning, please do a follow-up story on the one you did today about USDA promoting Bt genetic modification of corn and other food crops, such as how it contributes to the widespread destruction of population of butterflies and other beneficial insects on which 75% of all pollination depends. So that is an angry listener who has a serious agenda and who actually either just caught the story in a fleeting way and was like, BT, bad, must write something, or didn't hear the whole story and certainly didn't look at the story online, because the response is really not in, doesn't track with what the actual story said. This is a very typical response. I also then got a response from a colleague of the USDA scientist who I interviewed, and that colleague wanted to know how many people listen to our radio station, how many people visit our website, and they just wanted to track the exposure of their scientist in the world. And at the end of the message put, by the way, you did a great job. So.
My name's Lyle Muller, and I'm the executive director of Iowa Watch, which is a non-profit, nonpartisan news organization, but I've been an Iowa journalist since 1974. Although I did describe to some students this past week that my first job in journalism was actually in sports, and that as a side job I had to be a country music disc jockey at a radio station. So you do what you do in your first jobs. I worked at the Gazette for 25 years as a bureau chief up in Cedar Rapids and Iowa City, and eventually the editor, and joined Iowa Watch in 2012 because I was interested in what it was doing. It's a brand new organization. It's only been founded since February 2010. But we do focus on health and environmental reporting. In my early days as a reporter at the Gazette, I was privileged one year to be a counsel for the advancements of Science Writing Fellow. There were 7 of them given that year in North America, and it entitled me to an all-expense-paid trip to San Diego in November, where I sat inside looking outside how beautiful it was while I listened to science lectures all of the time. But I got that fellowship, I think in part because I had covered space research at the University of Iowa, and in my cover letter, they did accept me, even though in my cover letter I described how disappointed James Van Allen was when I told him I didn't understand any of the mathematics that he used in his equations to discover all of these different things that were going on out in space. Fortunately, I had the opportunity to sit down side by side with him and have him explain these things to me, which was an amazing experience when you get to sit with someone like James Van Allen, who talks about what's going on in the outer radiation belts of Earth. Recently, we've been working at Iowa Watch with Chris Martin, who's here, and we'll talk a little bit later about some of the reporting that's come out of a high school in Iowa, Cedar Falls. It's a project called Science in the Media, and we're finishing up the 3rd year, but we've worked with high school students to teach them how to do science reporting. Instead of using a model that often exists, which is to hear an opinion, report these different opinions so that people can determine their facts, we actually try to figure out what the facts are that scientists have best been able to determine so that people that can read about it and come up with their opinions. And so we've done this for 3 years with high school students, and we also have done it this year with some college students, journalists, trying to get them to dig deep into what would constitute a science-based story. So hopefully we'll get a chance to tell you a little bit more about that in the conference.
Hi, I'm Daniel Lathrop. So in all fairness, I work with Kylah, and I'm on Lyle's board. I spent about 15 years as a news reporter and doing, for a lot of that, doing what we call data journalism. So a mixture of using data to find and report stories and making pointy-clicky things on the internet. Project that I worked on a lot over that time of environment-related projects, from the political power of the oil and gas industry in their attempts to stifle action on global warming, a story that I worked on in 2003 and 2004. So all things old are new again, or all things old, in this case, just never go away. I also, in terms of, I also spent a lot of time being the person in a newsroom saying to other reporters, well, have you gone and looked and seen if there's any research on that? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
I'm Craig Just. I'm an associate professor at the University of Iowa. I'm in my 26th year there. I joined the tenure track about 6 years ago. Over the years, I've had various roles that kind of utilize my chemistry and biology roots, looking at all sorts of things in the water. I'm an analytical chemist by training, and so one of the things our environmental engineering and science program does is, you can give us a water sample and we can pretty much count, find, identify everything that's in there. When you're in Iowa and you do that, it can be a little bit disheartening because there are a lot of interesting things in our water. In our graduate program, I've been noticing that when we do our weekly seminars, we put up maps of the continental United States many times, and you can have harmful ag chemical of choice and look at a heat map, and Iowa just is constantly at the epicenter of these maps. And being from Iowa, I guess maybe I'm kind of used to that, but we've recruited students from all over the country, and we're like, well, come to Iowa and study toxic chemical of choice here, and live here while you do it. And so it's a little bit disheartening because also being from Iowa, I recognize the natural beauty in Iowa. I have a project right now where we're restoring several watersheds across Iowa for flood and water quality purposes. And being able to go out and see the people, we mentioned people here in the environment, kind of the intersection, to talk to folks in rural Iowa and see the beauty that is Iowa. Both, again, it's natural landscape. There's some of that still around. And even at times the curated landscape, to me, has its own beauty to it as well. And so that juxtaposition, right, that kind of natural beauty of people doing their thing and the environment doing its thing, but yet recognizing that there's some serious threats. Those things, worry me all the time, and I'm quite happy to be able to talk about such things, I guess. I'm looking for new ways, though, to talk about that science. I've talked about water quality for a long time. And it seems, at least in the 25 years that I feel like I've really been talking about that things haven't gotten better and candidly probably haven't even maintained what it was then. It's gotten probably worse in many ways. And so there must be a different way to talk about it. Potentially, there could be. And so I'm looking for that. And increasingly trying to couple this flood narrative, which is on people's minds. People do want to control flooding. They don't want to flood. They don't want that economic kind of that crushing blow to their communities and their croplands and things that are associated with flooding. And so if we can kind of take care of that problem, turns out many times there's a water quality benefit associated with those flood mitigation efforts. And so trying to find a way to kind of get some long-term objectives for me related to my science, but maybe using narratives in a different way. That's kind of some of the space I like to explore kind of right now with my science communication, I guess.
Great. All right, so we're going to touch on we're going to touch on a few topics up here, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So I think my first question to y'all is, it's going to be a twofold question. So what is, in your opinion, in terms of communicating about and/or reporting on, part of the issue with environmental and science journalism is that we're taking these really complex ideas and trying to distill them down into digestible stories for people. So what is the hardest part of that? And also, what do you find to be the most effective way to do that?
I'll start out. I think the hardest part is kind of marrying all of the different people who are involved in this communication process. There are scientists who like to take a look at broad questions, and they get excited when they find more questions. There are journalists who are trying to find answers to certain things, and then there's the third element, which we haven't mentioned yet, except Amy did briefly, and that is the audience, because they're the prime driver for what we do in journalism. We could write stories that would satisfy researchers, and an audience would get nothing out of it, because you'd be using the precise language that scientists do for a purpose, and that is because it means something, but that a general audience doesn't understand. And I think it's impractical, unfair, and not necessary to expect general audiences to understand all of the nuances that go on there. That's just not their world. They rely on researchers to do that, and then they rely on journalists to tell them that. So I think the most difficult thing is trying to answer the complexity with simplicity that still respects the complexity. And so I talk about that all the time with young journalists, that we're in the business of taking complexity, making it simple, but making sure that the simplicity that we talk about respects the complexity. It's always back and forth. We, as journalists, really do want to find out if you found a cure for something, and we want to know if you have found a better way to deal with something in the environment, and we're looking for a simple answer because our audience is. And so I think that's kind of the toughest thing for us, trying to deal with that real desire that we have for simplicity and not deal with complexity. When we turn the lights on here, we don't want to know that there are electrons that are going through the whole area. We just want to know if we turn the switch on, if the lights are on.
I think one really critical thing for journalism is that we tell stories about people. And so you can have a fantastic breakthrough, and it may be revolutionizing the sliver of science to which you have dedicated your life, and that's awesome. But until you can tell me a story about a person, it's probably not something my listeners are going to stick around for on the radio. And so we have two ways of getting at stories about science and the environment, either through the research and the researchers and the press releases and all of the information that is coming from the scientific world wanting to be covered, and from the lived experience of people in our communities that we cover and what questions those lived experiences raise. And so sometimes you discover that somebody has a problem, for example, a contaminated well or a playground that has some discolored thing bubbling up from a puddle or whatever it is, and you can approach a story from that. And when that story ultimately gets written, it's going to be, so-and-so went to pick up her kindergartner on the playground and discovered instead of his jeans being stained with grass, they were stained with some red chemical, right? That's a really gripping lead. On the other hand, if there is a researcher who says, we've been looking at runoff on playgrounds in 26 Iowa school districts, and it's looking like whatever the culprit is potentially contaminating these play spaces. I can talk to that researcher and I can find out why did they start asking this question, and how did they go about picking which communities they were going to evaluate, and what has the response been. And then when I have all of that, likely the researcher is going to lead me right to the family that had the kid with the red stained jeans. But if not, then I'm going to have to go visiting the communities and looking for somebody, because until there's a story about a person, chances are I'm not going to be able to tell the story in a way that people want to hear.
I think one of the challenging parts for me is I feel like I'm okay at taking complex things and using words that might be simple to describe them, but it's as a researcher, it's the loss of the narrative to a journalist. And for example, speaking of a nice people story, our local newspaper did a story at one of our high schools, and they had the science team building the biodiesel cars. And so they're making their own biodiesel, which is a neat science experiment, a lot of stuff to go with that. And they had this great story about this science team doing all this sort of stuff. And at the time, I was teaching our Introduction to Sustainability class. And, being sustainable fuel kind of a context, I was asked to comment. And, I made several other comments. But then the question then from the reporter was, essentially, do you think a biodiesel is like the fuel of the future? And it's not, in my view, it's not, right? And so I answered that question, but then when it got reported, great science story, and then Dr. Jess says that the students are wasting their time studying biofuels, and that was really not my response, and it was really not the proper context, and it just kind of, wow, okay, I hate all high school science evidently, and so, I think you have a couple of those things sort of happen to you as a researcher where a journalist is asking for comment, and then it comes out kind of that way. Intended or not, obviously, it's it kind of leads you to pause. a little bit. And so, I think that's the most challenging thing for me. A journalist is trying to distill, but then I'm also trying to distill as well, and trying to find that spot that we're comfortable with as scientists. Giving up that narrative to another is one of the hardest things I think to do for us.
So scientists are basset hounds and journalists are chihuahuas. We journalists are by design interested in what's new and what's happening, and by design,
Squirrel.
yeah, squirrel, exactly. We often want a quick answer to a complicated question, but sometimes we also want even a slow answer to, by our standards, is a quick answer. And the other thing that leads to is the fact that when what you cover is what's new, which is the DNA of journalism. The DNA of journalism is to cover what's new and what's changing and what's different. You can lose the thread of what's not new and what's not changing. And you can lose the thread of water quality in Iowa has been some of the worst in the country. I was a young reporter in Iowa. One of my colleagues did a story in Ames, Iowa, about College Creek. Those of you who do or have, it's just a little creek, and all of a sudden it was polluted with fecal coliform bacteria that was coming from ag runoff. And people freaked out, and we sent a reporter to cover it and figure out why it was there and what had happened and all of that. And I guarantee you that you could, with the exception of the particular level, you could do that story about College Creek today. It's just that the level just sort of went up above the health and safety boundaries briefly. So we're bad at that. And one of the areas that journalists and scientists really need to work on together is how to find what's new in these long-term, decades-long stories before there's a disaster. And having done a lot of stories about what turn out to be chronic problems in the aftermath of disasters that are a symptom of them, I will also say it's really hard to get the public engaged in things until there's a disaster. Suddenly we have, we have discolored water coming out of people's taps in Flint, and all of a sudden nationally we're going to be concerned about water quality and drinking water quality, which and
water infrastructure.
And water infrastructure, right? And it's something that, honestly, having done stories back when I was a beat reporter and tried to get people, every year, water quality reports come out, thanks under the Pure Drinking Water Act, trying to get people interested in the quality of their drinking water until something bad happens is really hard. So, I think those are kind of the two things, which is the public has a short attention span. And journalists have an even shorter attention span. And scientists have a very long, slow attention span, which is a really bad mismatch, even when your priorities are the same.
Yeah, I'll just capitalize on that, just talking to y'all from the research. The research has shown that, if you want to persuade people about something, throwing a bunch of statistics at them is not the way to do it. The way to persuade people is with stories and with narratives and with people. And, this is why every president since, Ronald Reagan, when they do the State of the Union, they talk about their policies, but then they also talk about, Joe the plumber, or, they have like 5 people that are in the audience audience that they talk about how their policies are affecting, because that's what we respond to as human beings. I think the other thing I wanted to touch on is, particularly with talking about research, too often journalism is, and not the fault of journalists, this is just the way our industry is. They talk about individual research studies. And what I've been trying to do with part of my research and in talking to journalists is train people to contextualize that within the large, because I do a research study, but that's not the end-all be-all. There's about 50 other research studies, and you need to contextualize that. And I think that's something that we're trying to work on, hopefully. But yeah, everything that y'all are saying tracks with the research that I've been doing and that my colleagues have been doing. So, given that, I thought that you guys could talk a little bit, just not in terms of, the mismatch of scientists and journalists and the public and what the public is interested in, but just the day-to-day, what makes it hard to do your job?
Well, I think being accurate makes it hard. Really, I mean, it's just the pursuit of accuracy is hard work. It's really easy to pick up a newspaper or watch a newscast or listen to a report and consume it. And it seems like it just was so easy to prepare that report. But pursuing the truth is difficult. And especially when it comes to when you're talking about multiple research, they conflict. And so David Wallace Wells wrote a famous piece in New York Magazine a couple of years ago, The Uninhabitable Earth. And it starts with doomsday. It is, I promise, worse than you think. If your anxiety about global warming is dominated by fears of sea level rise, you are barely scratching the surface of what terrors are possible, even within the lifetime of a teenager today. And so the question becomes, is he telling the truth, or is that his opinion? And that's what we wrestle with when we're trying to deal with science reporting. We know that we're dealing with opinion, but that it's informed opinion, but is it accurate? And how do we as non-scientists challenge that science? So and by the way, there was immediate criticism of David Wallace Wells' work from researchers around the world, but then and as soon as the criticisms came, then his defenders came, saying, nope, it's based on scientific research. So I think that's a difficult quest for us, to try to be accurate as best as we can.
Closed access science. Journalists do not have access to academic libraries in general. Journalists do not have access to journal publications. If you are a scientist, your work, your important work, we can't read it. So when we miss it, it may not be as surprising as you think. It can be as easy as, boy, that looked like an interesting article. Too bad all I can see is the abstract.
I'm going to jump in here, and then I'll let y'all go. I just listened to David Foster Wallace on a, right, is that the name?
Wallace Wells.
David Wallace Wells, sorry.
Yeah.
Wrong David. But no, I just listened to him on a podcast. I forget that he was talking, because he just wrote a book based on the article.
It leads with the same sentence.
Yeah, but he says that in the book he didn't focus on the worst case scenario. He focused on the likely scenario, and it's still scary. I haven't read the book yet, but
Well, and his article, I've read all his articles on this, and it is a lot of doomsday stuff, but he does have optimism in there. It's just that some of the critics chose to ignore it. I mean, it's hard to ignore the optimism when you actually write a piece about how today's children should sue the current generation for their constitutional right to constitutional right for equal protection, so that the children can have the same earth that we have. So yeah, I mean, that sounds a little negative, but he does have right with some optimism, even in these articles that were criticized.
yeah. And then just on what Daniel was saying, I was actually listening to another podcast. I think it was a Vox podcast, and they were talking about the lack of access to academic journals. I would like to point out, though, if you do see the abstract of an article that you like, as a journalist, you can always email the researcher, and we're more than happy to share our research with you. But
Yeah, that is definitely true. It's a really hard way to do a lit review. Having worked on some of the projects I've worked on where I had to get the papers I wanted, email 20 when I was a newspaper reporter, 20 or 30 different people. Luckily, a lot of people do repost their things on their personal website. I got very good at Google, file type, PDF, name of the researcher, name of the.
But yeah,
name of
it's
the
harder
article.
than it should be, for sure.
It just, and I think that does go beyond journalists. There's a move in journalism actually not to cover research studies that aren't either open access or that you aren't allowed to repost. It is not a very successful move because it misaligns with all of the other incentives of journalism, but it is keeping science behind a paywall out of the hands of the public has the designed effect of keeping science out of the hands of people who don't pay for it, even if they are the people who, on another level, did pay for it.
And there is actually some movement, and there's been some good journalism around the question of why are these scientific journals funded and managed the way that they are. Because it also costs the researchers a lot of money to publish in an open access journal, which puts a different question and burden on them. This is actually a really great opportunity to put in a plug for public media, because as an Iowa Public Radio employee, I am an Iowa State University affiliate, so I actually do have access to academic journals, which is really quite handy. Which doesn't mean that I'm doing comprehensive lit reviews, even though one could argue that I could, because my stories are, a long story for me is 4 minutes long. In a 4-minute story, if I can fit in 4 voices, I may have put in too many people for my listener to pay attention to. If I'm going to have one person in there who is the character, the driving, humanizing voice of the story, that leaves me maybe 3 people to tell the rest of the story with me. And so one of the challenges is that in the audience, there is still sometimes an expectation that for every yin you have a yang. There's no longer a call within mainstream media to have climate deniers every time we do a climate change story, but that's been the past 5 or 10 years that's finally become accepted. The example I gave with my GMO story, there are those who would say that anytime I do something about GMOs, I ought to be including an anti-GMO activist or someone who is trying to develop some technology that would counter. And GMOs, again, offer one more challenge, which is people who are paying attention to one issue typically are on a side of that issue, and they will then have blinders on. And it's really difficult to, for example, communicate the fact that genetic modification is a technology, it is a strategy, and it is used in lots of different applications, in medicine, in agriculture, in many different ways. So to complain or to hypothesize that pollinators are damaged by GMOs is a way generalization. And so if pollinators are being damaged by a particular thing, it may be the particular genetic modification of a particular seed. And there's a lot of research into that. But the activists think that GMOs are all bad. And so you end up with this, to your question about what makes your job hard, what makes the job hard is that there can be very loud voices that are sometimes not representing a lot of people, but getting a lot of attention, or those very loud voices can be very steeped in a particular narrative, and if you try to poke holes in that narrative, then they take it as an affront to their entire cause, and therefore you're not, you're being biased because you're attacking them or their organization. And so trying to, within the confines of the space that we work in, stay true to the science that the researchers have dedicated their lives to, distill it in a way that is accessible and interesting to an audience, not be swayed by the loudest voices, but also respect and listen to those loud voices. It puts a lot of information into a reporter who then has to figure out a way to get it out. I am often asked, how long are your stories? And I say, oh, well, a long feature is about 4.5 minutes. And then people will say to me, what do you do with the rest of your day?
One of the hard things for me as a scientist and an engineer in this context is we're not really trained, how to do this, and we presume that our papers are accessible by, a lot more people than they obviously are. And so one of the nice things, I guess, for me is last June I had a week-long fellowship sponsored by AAAS called the Leshner Fellowship, and the whole point of that fellowship is to get folks like me in the midst of journalists and other science communicators for, a week-long training on how to do it and how to do that well. And that's where I learned some of the stuff that Daniel just said and other people have been talking about on this panel so far. And the idea that you as a scientist shouldn't just presume that your research papers are going to get discovered by somebody on a science beat. You can actually take your own abstract and your own papers and you can start to push those things out, constructed in a certain way that can be readily absorbed by a science reporter. And I think increasingly we're gonna need to have those skills to do that, because the media, again, open access, all these sorts of things that, and by the way, there is a big push. The California schools in particular, the university system there, just recently announced that they're pushing back and saying, if this stuff isn't going to be open access, we're not going to publish in the biggest, journal system in the world. And so, all those incentives, all that stuff's being turned around, and I think we all are in an interesting time to try to figure out how to talk to each other such that then good information can get where it needs to be. It's really easy to send bad information all around. And so, again, that's why, I applaud this sort of an event. So that we can learn how to do that better in the current context. And so part of my mission this particular year after the Leshner Fellowship is to have my own personal communication plan as a scientist and an engineer, with a logic model and where do I want to be in a year from now? Where do I want to be 2 years from now in my science communication? Because it's implied here that we're just going to get a call on the phone and we need to give an answer really quick to some science reporter, and that may be the case, but there are other mechanisms, though, to get our science out there in a much more systematic way. That's be much more comforting to me as a researcher. Again, that long-term gestation that we've been talking about. But then there's also, as part of the Leshner Fellowship, an institutional change goal, and that's another reason why I'm here today, is to let folks that, we got some young folks here that are coming up in science and engineering and other fields. There are some resources out there, and I think it'd be it would be wise if you would take advantage of some of those now and start to understand how those things can be embedded in the work that you do going forward. I think you'll have a much better relationship with your own science and then the way that science gets distributed in the public media.
All right, I'm going to do one last question, and then I'll open it up to the audience. But, say you're a young, researcher, and you're, want to get your research out there. You want to, put together your own, communication plan. What's the single greatest piece of advice you have for those researchers?
I would say understand that a journalist's responsibility is to its audience, and that we're trying to explain to them. That's one. Number two, it's a pretty good chance that we don't understand fully the science that you're dealing with. We may be, even if you're a science reporter, we don't understand this. At a science briefing I went to, I was watching some of these nationally known science reporters interview researchers, and there was one guy from AP who would always say, now I have to write this for Joe Sixpack. How can I explain this to Joe Sixpack? And you would make the researcher do that. So I asked the reporter afterwards, hey, that's a good idea. How'd you come up with that? And he says, I asked that so that I understand it. and then I can write it accurately. So kind of having that understanding that we aren't in the lab, but we are floating around with those audiences with those questions. And if you can work with us there, then that helps us get to the point where we can try to get into your lab and understand the context and the nuances that you're dealing with.
Go ahead.
The biggest piece of advice I can give you is going to give in the form of a story. So in the 1st century BCE, there was, I'm Jewish, there was a rabbi named Hillel. Hillel was a great scholar, not the greatest, but one of the greatest scholars of Judaism of his day. And a different version of the story have it being a different person, but we'll just say a Gentile, non-Jew, comes to Shammai, who is the preeminent sage of his day, says, can you explain to me, standing on one foot, what is this religion of yours? And of course, Shammai reacts the way all of us would react, which is he tells this person what he can do with himself. So next he goes to Hillel. Hillel picks up one foot and says, what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. Everything else is commentary. What I would recommend to you is figure out how to communicate the essence of what you're trying to say while standing on one foot.
Wow.
Well, one thing is, if you, as a scientist, also wish to be a science communicator, join the National Association of Science Writers, which is connected with the Council for the Advancement of Science Writing that was mentioned earlier. I guess I have 2 other ideas. One is, if you're a university-based researcher, get to know the person in the news office who's going to be responsible for writing about your papers when they are published. I hear a lot of frustration from scientists when I've received a press release and I call the scientist and the scientist says, well, the press release didn't really emphasize what I would emphasize, or it really kind of exaggerated my findings. So as a researcher within your institution, figure out who's going to be writing and sending out those press releases and establish a relationship with that person so that when you have something that they want to write about, you are confident that the story that you want told about your work is the one that's going to be presented to us if there's a press release. And then the other thing I would say is get to know your local media. So if you're at Iowa State and you call up a reporter at the Ames Tribune and you just say, come to my lab, you might be thinking to yourself, well, it's just the Ames Tribune. I mean, this reporter might not even be here in a year when I finally publish these results. The experience of having the relationship with the reporter will introduce you to the kinds of questions the reporter's going to ask. And the reporter will grow to be a little more comfortable with a scientist for having had that experience in your lab. And similar to the distilling and tell it to a Joe six-pack, I will sometimes say to somebody, okay, that's really interesting. I really want to understand this. Now, if you were going to go talk to a class of 7th graders, how would you tell them your story?
My biggest piece of advice would be to communicate early and communicate often in a variety of formats. Think of the biggest, musician that you like, and maybe they're a nationally known artist or international artist, and then go way back to their beginnings. And they're doing the club over here, they're doing the small venue over there, on their way to then, mega stardom. If you're going to be that scientist or engineer that's going to, have the big thing, make sure you can talk at the Science Cafe in Mount Vernon, right? The EHSRC sponsors a series there, just a few Iowa folks and a little cafe in Mount Vernon, Iowa, and you better be able to talk there in addition to, candidly, in preparation for being able to talk in these other venues in these other ways. And I think that does, you would never say that out loud to a group of adults that you're targeting a 7th grade audience, right? That's not good. That's not good strategy, but to at least say it out loud. But it is a good strategy to be thinking about that. Not because the folks there aren't intelligent or something like that. It just means such a wide range of backgrounds. And so why not treat that group as a broad audience like we've been talking about here, and try to communicate your science at the lowest common denominator level in some ways that resonate with that particular group. And so do that early and do that often, as frequently as you can.
Yeah, as I train, I teach PR classes at the University of Iowa, and as I train my students, it's being simplistic. It's not dumbing it down. And I use the example. I mean, I have a PhD. I'm a fairly educated person. I know nothing about the economy, so you need to communicate about the economy to me at like a 7th grade level for me to understand it. But
If I could add one thing. For those of you who are senior faculty who are in the room, the thing you can do to support young scholars is find a way to support their public engagement and their public work as a significant part of the tenure process. It is there is really no good incentive for young scientists to engage with the public in a meaningful way.
no, there's actually disincentives.
There are strong disincentives. It's time consuming, and right, it can occasionally and sometimes it blows up in your face, and so and certainly being publicly controversial is definitely not is something as an academic pre-tenure you really want to avoid. So I would that's not an answer to the question, but it actually is an important fact of the question. If you are an associate or a full professor, the next time your department reviews your tenure guidelines, think about, should an op-ed in the New York Times count at the same as a similar essay in a journal? Because right now, in most cases, it doesn't.
Agree. Questions?
Hello, Thomas Robinson from the University of Iowa. Interested in what your thoughts are on best practices for communicating uncertainty and risk in writing.
Well, for starters, you're up against the challenge of a general population audience, a general audience population that would probably define those words differently than how you are currently thinking of them. So I think we have to not pose things in an either or, if that's really not what it is. Uncertainty, I mean, I hear that word all the time in the context of agriculture, farming, and federal policy. Senator Grassley loves to say farmers need certainty. We must implement the Farm Bill because farmers need certainty. There's no certainty in farming. That's actually at the crux of the reason that they need certainty, right? And risk also is some people would consider walking across the street in these icy conditions risky. Some people would not consider jumping out of an airplane with a parachute to be risky. So when you're thinking about risk, you want to be really clear in your own reporting and in your own mind about what is this risk that I'm talking about. And if there's not a natural way to illustrate that for whoever your audience is, you need to go back to the source of this risk concern and ask them to give you some kind of a metaphor or an example or it's something that puts it into context, because just a number like the risk of this is 1 in 10 billion means nothing to anybody. Even 1 in 10, that's a little more fathomable, but you want to be able to say the risk of dying from the flu is statistically similar to the risk of whatever something else is. I don't know. I don't have any idea what would be appropriate, but something that people can more relate to. The risk of getting the measles right now in the Pacific Northwest is higher than it seemed to have been 5 years ago, but actually is probably not higher. It's just that there's an outbreak happening now. So that's another example of we want to think when the conditions have changed, what causes them has changed, but sometimes that's the case and sometimes it's not. So it's, I guess, bottom line, you have to really understand it yourself before you're going to be able to convey it to an audience.
Explanation's really helpful. We've dealt with this over the last 15 to 20 years with what's a 100-year flood and what's a 500-year flood, and we keep going. We just had 3 100-year floods in 15 years. What's the deal here? Well, one's a 500-year flood, or the explanations that finally came out, not necessarily in 1993, but in 2008, the explanations of what does that term 100-year flood means. I think that's important and helpful. in our industry, we talk a lot about media literacy, trying to train people what goes into putting together a news story and how to consume news stories. But I think scientific literacy is important too. And the best researchers I've worked with have explained to me probability, risk, and where they are with something. If you make a discovery, the best ones have told me where that fits in with all of the other discoveries and what questions it leads to. And that always thrilled me as a reporter, by the way. It was, okay, what questions are you going to work on now?
Yeah. Have anything to? Yeah, I will say, as a social scientist, but scientists in general are a lot more comfortable with uncertainty than the general public is.
Emery Styron. I'm a former newspaperman and a freelance writer. I was curious, I know that a lot of university research is federally funded, but I think maybe some of it is corporate funded. And I just wondered how the corporate funding should be part of this discussion.
I believe it should be reported in the stories, so we always ask, who's supporting this research if we're writing about research. At Iowa Watch, we don't necessarily write about one research project. We take a look at a variety of things. But when I would cover discoveries, I would always try to report on who funded it.
Yeah, it's a challenging question as a researcher. Federal funding is increasingly, it seems like it's a little harder to come by these days in general, very competitive. Which is good in some regards, but difficult to kind of maintain a program on in other regards. And so the allure of corporate or just as an engineer, there's some industries that could use some of our work. And so I worked at the largest potato processing plant in the world on a project in Oregon. Rhymes with Denida or Ida, and it was a really amazing project, and it funded a master's student, very applied research, and I always told that group, because there were consequences with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, based on the outcomes of that research on some of the operational parameters they would have to do with their starchy wastewater that they were dealing with there, which again on the spectrum of things isn't all that nasty. It's kind of a resource if you use it wisely. But in the end, I had to tell that group, you can pay for the research, but you don't get to buy the answers. And if that's up front somehow, if you're able to do that as a researcher and keep that line there, so you can have a cordial relationship, with that funder and with the project in mind, as long as those boundaries can kind of be set up front. I'm okay with it, but at the same time, yes, I do need to disclose that that's where that funding came from for any sort of publications and whatnot that come out with that. And it's a complicating factor, I think, for my work. But
does disclosing that color the way that information is received?
Well, I think it will with some audiences, right?
Yeah.
Because audience take beliefs, attitudes, and values to a story. So if you're predisposed to think that Monsanto sponsoring research into dicamba taints the research, then you're going to believe that as an audience. But if you are predisposed to think that Monsanto is supporting that research because they want to find a safe way to use dicamba, which expands their business, that's a different kind of mindset. And so, there are some points that I think you can only go so far, and I could come up with some neat scenarios where you convince people the other way, but you never will, because they bring their belief, attitude, and value to the table.
I think this is a place where if you're covering these things as a reporter, you need to enlist some help. I would always try to go to some scientists who I knew, maybe scientists who are not that close, who are only sort of generally in the same field. If there's corporate-sponsored research and you're interested in it, to a large extent, the methodologies in any published research are still are going to be transparent enough that somebody who, not you, But somebody who is knowledgeable about the field and knowledgeable about the standards of the field can look at it and tell you, whether there's an issue. And the issue may not be that it's bad science. The issue may just be that it's only designed to look at this thing, and that thing over here may be somewhat distracting from this other thing over here. And that's one of the things that a corporate sponsor is going to do. They're going to pick, demonstrably over the years, they do pick projects that they think are likely to be useful to them in some way. And that useful may just be functionally useful. They want to know what to do with their starchy wastewater. And sometimes they may have to do with a greater public policy debate. And so it's important to be careful. It's important, particularly in the field of medical research. Some things have definitely come out. It's not a bad thing if you're covering a public institution to request the contracts that have been signed. There are contracts that have been signed by researchers that never should have been, that give their corporate sponsors prior review over publication of results. And so, bad things do happen, and doing some due diligence when you're covering things, particularly things that you think are going to shape public debate, is not a bad idea. It is also the case that there is no default reason to believe that because a company sponsored something, that the results are going to go their way, or that the results are shaped by that.
I think I was just going to add, if peer-reviewed journal articles will state where the funding comes from, and I will always look at that. And then if there's a corporate funder, I'll look to see how much. You can it'll usually say the percentage, or you can ask the researchers for the percentage to try to get a feel for what the level of interest of that corporate sponsor was in the project. If I find out about the research because the corporation sends me information about it, or if the research is not peer-reviewed, then I'm not going to cover it. It may be an interesting idea, but I'm not going to cover it as something that's research.
Kate Payne with Iowa Public Radio. Craig, earlier you said that the narrative around water quality isn't working and that it needs to change. What do you mean there? How does it need to change?
It hasn't worked for me, and if you look at the results in Iowa, it hasn't really worked for Iowa. I think, so my kids grew up, the Iowa River looks, at our table someone drew the Iowa River and it was kind of chocolate milk brown. It will be again in April. In particular, it always looks like that. And if that's what you've always grown up with, like for those of you that grew up and where all the trees are and all this other stuff, for those of us that grew up in Iowa, that's really kind of all we knew. And so then that's water quality. And then you don't see the degradation over time. You don't know what it looked like 50 years ago because you didn't grow up kind of then, and you kind of don't tell those stories. And then a lot of today's threats in our waters are, you can't see them. There are a variety of agrochemicals and different things like that. And so it's a very difficult narrative to try to get people kind of working around and then wanting to potentially vote around, or to invest some money into some of the solutions that go with that. And I've tried all sorts of ways to make it relational to folks. Disasters were mentioned earlier. I used to put our water quality in the context of nutrients in words, related to Gulf hypoxia, but we have our own harmful algal blooms right here in Iowa now. Great, now I can really talk about water quality because there's like a disaster people can see. I don't want to get there. I don't want to get to some sort of ecosystem tipping point before we can have an urgent conversation about water quality, but that seems to be where we're at. Versus the flood narrative, floods were already mentioned, and by the way, the 500-year flood, there are folks that after they experienced the 100-year flood and had flood insurance, that then canceled their policy saying, I won't live another 100 years, right? I won't live another 100 years. And so, but that flood piece, that's a lot more visual, and candidly for me, if I can't get urgency about water quality in, and again, the scientific literacy way or whatever, then by golly, I'll try to get the objectives in another way in the meantime. I think it's just trying to use all the resources that we might have and the tools available to us to just meet our objectives as someone who wants to try to clean it up. That's I think what we all need to be about a little bit.
All right, one more question.
Hello. So in my experience, there can sometimes be a lot of like anxiety after an interview with a researcher. On the researchers' end especially, like sometimes they seem to be nervous that you're going to tell their story wrong, and they want to see what you're writing before you publish it. And then, as a writer, you're scared that your brain isn't processing right and you're going to tell the story wrong. Or you make some kind of decision, and then Larry Weber's calling the newsroom about your headline. So how can and should we balance our, maintaining control over the story and our responsibility to our audience with our dual responsibility to get the story right and not misrepresent what a researcher is doing?
I feel that a lot of nervous researchers, I've had even researchers contact me after a story has aired and been published and ask if he can change a quote, even though it was recorded and aired. There was no question of the transcript or the content being wrong. People just sometimes don't like the thing that they said. Which happens to all of us, right? Like, we've certainly all had the experience of walking away from a conversation and realizing, oh, I wish I hadn't told whoever it was that thing in that way. I think there's a few things. When you are initiating the conversation with the person you're interviewing, always be very clear about what you're doing and what your intentions are. So like in my case, I'm always recording, and I always get permission from the person I'm talking to make that recording. That can also be a comfort. Sometimes it makes somebody really nervous, especially when I'm like literally putting the microphone in their face, but it can also be a comfort because then of course I can transcribe and they can listen and read and know that, what they've told me is, what I've written down is what they told me. But I also always tell them, I'm recording this, we're not live on the radio. If you misspeak, stop and say it again. Or if you start going down a path and realize that's not actually what you want to tell me, just say, actually, let me start that over again. And they'll start it over again. Don't be afraid to go back to the person between the end of your interview and when you submit your story to make sure you got something right, to clarify. If you have something and you know that what you've written down is what they've said and it just doesn't sound right and you think maybe they misspoke, for example, call them back, ask them about that. Or if you can't do that, just don't use that part of it, And then the other thing is, know ahead of time very clearly from your editor what's our policy about sharing information before the story is published. In every newsroom I've worked in, it has always been, no, you may not see the story before it is published. But in some newsrooms, and not in all, there is a willingness to let someone see the transcript of the quotes that we're going to be using. And so if that is the policy and the researcher asks only if they ask, then I will say, you can't see the story before it airs, but I'm happy to share with you the quotes. And sometimes I'll even give them like the sentence leading into it or the sentence between the two quotes if I feel like that's going to be critical for them to know that I've understood what I'm using and how I'm using it. But yeah, no prior review.
I think it's okay to rephrase and talk to the, it's easier in print to do this because you don't have that recorder going. But I often would with a researcher say, this is what I've written down. Tell me if I've got this right. And I'll give them what my impression is of what they said. And I would do that an awful lot. I did read back quotes sometimes to people if they asked, because I said, I want to make sure that I got this right because, not just is it them saying something, boy, if you forget the word not in a quote, that makes a big difference. And you want to be, and I always did this so that I was accurate. I never did it to satisfy them. I did it so that I was accurate. But the byproduct was it satisfied them, and then they trusted you more. And some of them would call me up and not go through the PR department and say, I want you to come over and see what I got in my lab going on right now. But yeah, regurgitate it back to them, make sure that you've done it accurately.
Yeah, I would say when you're covering something complicated that you don't necessarily understand and you're talking to an expert, you should 100% go back and paraphrase. I don't read verbatim, but I will step by step through what I'm saying and paraphrase it to them. And I will usually try and do that once during the interview, and depending on the length of time, I will, if it has taken a while between the interview and publication, I will call them back again and say, hey, the story's coming, just want to step through again. Here's basically what I'm repeating that you said. Is that accurate? And again, I'm doing that for accuracy, but also, and it builds source relationships over time, as Lyle said. But I think it's the no surprises rule is really important in this kind of reporting. The person you interviewed should not be surprised by what's in your story. And so making sure that you have done your reporting in a way where you know that person is going to know what's coming, even if they're maybe not going to love it. Like sometimes you write a story about somebody's science and you're putting some other voices in there, and they're not going to love those. It's important that they not be surprised by anything you're putting in their mouth.
I think that's a good place to end. Sorry, went a few minutes over, but thank y'all.